first of all, welcome to the Danube Institute, and welcome to this event on From Statecraft to Soulcraft, How Non-Liberal Regimes Rule Through the Good Life. My name is Callum Nicholson. I'm Director of Research here at the Danube Institute. And today for this event, we're very fortunate to have with us three of our fellows, although Philip Pilkington occasionally, we're not sure which institute he is at, but he is indeed here. So we have Philip Pilkington, a Senior Research Fellow at the Hungarian Institute of International Affairs. And we have Eric Hendricks, Visiting Fellow here at the Danube Institute. And our special speaker today is Alex Lefebvre, who's a professor at the University of Sydney. And we've been very glad to have him with us for the last month, I think for another couple of weeks, where he's been doing some research into what the good life means in a sort of conservative or post-liberal context. And while we've been here, we were thinking, well, of course, Philip recently wrote a book which was a critique of liberalism. And Alex is himself openly a liberal. And so we thought this would be a great opportunity to have a good debate between them. And Eric is somewhere in between, agrees and disagrees with both. So we thought we have the full spectrum here of perspectives. So what we're going to do this evening is Alex is going to talk for 15, 20 minutes maybe. And both of them will then do a response for maybe 5 minutes or 10 minutes. And then we'll have a discussion between us, which I will moderate. So with no further ado, let's hand it over to Alex.
Thank you.
I think you can use these or this.
Thank you, Callum, for that warm introduction and for outing me as a liberal. I want to give my warm thanks to the Danube Institute and its leadership, John, Melissa in absentia, Esteban, and Callum for making me feel so welcome. Can you hear me in the back? Yeah. To my fellows who have been correcting all my mistakes and preconceptions about Hungary, and very warmly to the professional staff who has just gone over and above. Anna, where are you? High five, Anna. Thank you. So this keynote is based on an essay I wrote for a magazine last year. The magazine's called Noema, and it's the core of the book project that I'm working on right now. And the working title of the book is going to be called The Good Life State. And what I'm going to do right now is I'm going to just state the thesis up front, and then I'm going to work backwards and try to earn it for you. Here's the thesis. I'll say it bluntly. So all around the world, states that think of themselves as non-liberal, post-liberal, or just basically done with liberalism are reviving one of the oldest and most fundamental ambitions in the history of political thought, which is that politics should help form citizens, should shape their character, their loyalties, and their loves so that they live well and flourish. That's what I mean, that's what I mean by Soulcraft, when the state becomes explicit and intentional about orienting its members towards a preferred picture of the good life, what to admire, what to aspire to, and what kind of life deserves honor and support. Simple, right? Who could object with such a noble ambition? The answer, of course, is liberals. And it's with liberalism that I want to begin. And I want to start first with how liberalism thinks about the state and the role of politics, and next, why I think, despite being a liberal, I think my fellow liberals get it badly wrong. So let me start here. Now, in addition to being a political philosopher and a professor of politics, I am also an accomplished artist. And as a treat for you tonight, I've drawn how liberals understand liberalism. Let me walk you through it. So I wrote the big box. The word is bad. I wrote it as a technical philosopher. The top box should read liberal political framework, so like constitution rights. So the basic idea of how I think mainstream liberals understand liberalism is that the state should provide a framework for people with different conceptions of the good life to be able not just not to kill each other, but to get along and affirm a similar set of political and moral values. So on the bottom there, you have a kind of walks into a bar joke. You got a Christian, a Buddhist, a Muslim, and they all show up to this country. And then what you have is a legal and political framework that manages that kind of pluralism so they can all have deep value commitments, but they can cohabit in one fairly happy, fairly stable society. So in this sense, the liberal state should be hands-off. It shouldn't tell people how to live, and it should just provide a framework. I know this isn't this isn't a class, but does that make sense? We're good as a starting point? All right, cool. So that's how liberals understand liberalism. I think they are badly wrong about one important thing and about what liberalism has become in the 21st century. And so last year, I wrote a book about it. Well, last year, it's 2020. I feel old already. 2024, it still feels fresh to me. And that book was called Liberalism as a Way of Life, published by Princeton. So the 2-minute version of my argument is that I don't believe that the standard picture that liberals have about liberalism reflects the reality of liberal democratic countries. In particular, that standard vision with the stick people and the box doesn't capture the extent to which liberal values have spread out, seeped, infiltrated, if you like, into the wider culture of liberal democracies, such that people who live, not Hungary perhaps, but I live in Australia, I'm Canadian, United States, UK, Germany, etc., that people who inhabit those countries and those cultures are socialized 24/7 into liberal values. So that most people today acquire their liberalism not through like civics lesson or instruction, but through Netflix, by using dating apps, by codes of child-centered parenting, and so on and so forth. And I'm not kidding around. Here's the last two sentences of my book. I write, liberalism is the source of my soul. The wager of this book is that the same is probably true of you. Not you, fine people, totally different. This is not the crowd I imagine. I mean my fellow groupthink liberals. That's my true public. So that's the pitch of the book. Now, liberals don't see liberalism that way because they want to be this cute, neutral, tidy thing. But you know who sees liberalism in the way I do? I love it and they hate it. It's conservative critics of liberalism, particularly in the United States. So a very famous one will be known to everyone in this room is Patrick Deneen's Why Liberalism Failed, but I could cite dozens of others to this same strident effect. So the take-home message here is that basically liberalism is, if you know your horror movies, the Blob. It absorbs everything into its ambit and sucks the life of it all, transforming all in its wake. So liberalism, to quote, is not merely, as is often portrayed, a narrowly political project of constitutional government and juridical defense of rights. Rather, it seeks to transform all of human life and the world. And nothing infuriates these critics of liberalism more than liberalism's pretense of neutrality on questions of the good life. To them, the claim that liberalism welcomes all rival, that it loves every kind of person, and doesn't impose its own conception of the good life, well, that's just bullshit. It is self-delusion and hypocrisy at its worst. Now, whether or not liberals or you or whoever agree with this picture of liberalism, it doesn't really matter because the horse is bolted. This has become a near consensus view that is held in conservative circles, namely that liberalism is hegemonic. And second, here's the real point, that I believe that many countries, some democratic and some not, feel that it's time to fight fire with fire and use political power to promote alternative and non-liberal ways of life. Or to use a word that I'll define in a couple of minutes, I want to say, if you're a political philosopher, perfectionism is back big time. So all around the world, states are starting to use soft and sometimes hard political power to promote visions of the good life. And that, to my mind, is what unifies regimes that on paper look totally dissimilar and, in fact, opposed. So I'm talking, for example, of China, India, Russia, Hungary, Iran, Israel, Turkey, MAGA USA, and many others. They are repudiating, turning their back on the idea that the state should be ethically neutral with respect to the good life and pursuing their own suitably adapted versions of what that might mean. And what I want to do for this book that I'm writing is I'm consider me the mole of liberalism. I want to embed in these kinds of places, hang out in really good faith, and try to capture what the idea of the good life is in this place, and try to write it up with as much generosity and show the attraction as I can, even though I have deep objections to it. So, going to talk to this sounds like I'm in a zoo. It sounds offensive, and I'm sorry. I don't mean it to sound like this. But the question I want to ask these post-liberals is first, the general architecture, is what's your country's dominant conception of the good life? Second, why do you think that conception of the good life of your country and your culture is excellent and worthy of devotion? And third, how does and how should your state advance it? And again, I don't want this to be a critical or hostile project. I want to try to understand these visions from the inside. Now, when I talk to liberals about my idea, and when I make this pitch to a liberal audience, which is basically every single university I've ever been to, they're about ready to burst right now and shout out the following objection. The objection goes something like this. Hey, Alex, having just written a book on liberalism, you now want to be a shill, a useful idiot for illiberal regimes by attributing to them ideals that they pay no more than lip service to. In other words, Alex, dummy, wake up. The real goal of these places is power, not ethical visions of human excellence and of living well. This, at any rate, is the widely held view by the mainstream liberal commentariat. They claim that countries like Russia, Hungary, China, and MAGA are driven by greed, not ideals, anger, not affection, and interests, not human goods. So to take two recent examples, one from, frankly, a persona non grata at this institution is Anne Applebaum and Autocracy, Inc., but essentially her whole oeuvre works on this point, which is that basically what gets illiberal leaders like Viktor Orban up in the morning is a quote-unquote ruthless, single-minded determination to preserve the wealth and power of themselves and their cadre. Ditto for the American who just hightailed it and moved to my Canada, Timothy Snyder. I reviewed this book very unfavorably in TLS last year. And in On Freedom, he claims that the world is basically divided into two types of political systems. On the one hand, you have liberal democracies which embrace values. On the other hand, you have autocracies which lack values entirely. So the tens of millions of voters who put their hand up for Trump, well, they are quote-unquote pseudo-populists who enjoy inflicting pain on others more than helping themselves. What about China? Well, that country is quote-unquote an open-air prison. And more generally, whenever a country veers away from liberal democracy on this view, the only real question to ask is whether it's using oligarchy to get to fascism, like Russia or Turkey, or fascism to get to oligarchy, like Brazil and India. So from this perspective, the illiberal world, the non-liberal democratic world, boils down to three basic points, premises, sad truths. First, that contemporary, again, I'm voicing the opinion, it's not my opinion. Contemporary liberal regimes rule mainly through repression, violence, and corruption. Second, their leaders are driven by the spoils of tyranny. You name it, money, power, sex, glory. And last, their populations are either deceived or worse, incapable of tolerating pluralism. Now, I don't mean to deny that some of this is true. Take the case of Russia. I do believe it is driven in part by corruption and repression. But that, I believe, is, 30% true. And this picture simply cannot account for the stability or the attractiveness of these regimes to their population. And that's why my book is trying to write out from a liberal sensitivity from a different set of proposals. First, I want to claim that major illiberal regimes worldwide do not lack values and ideals. They positively overflow with them. Second, they believe in their values sincerely and they advance positive and specific visions of human flourishing for their members. And third, they use the soft and sometimes hard powers of the state to realize their visions of the good life. And here let me come back to the term I mentioned a moment ago. Perfectionism, which is what I want to say is back on the world stage. Liberals had thought it was dead and buried, but nuh-uh. So here's a definition of this core term. It might not be relevant for you, but it's a key term for me, so I'll introduce it. So in contemporary Anglo-American political philosophy, perfectionism is understood as the idea that the state may or should promote valuable conceptions of the good life and discourage conceptions that are worthless or bad. So in short, perfectionism is the exercise of state power to shape and enforce ideals of human flourishing. And what evidence do I have that it's ascendant across the globe? Frankly, just open your eyes. China, for one, could not be more explicit. President Xi has unveiled a new model of modernization aimed, quote unquote, at enriching the people's spiritual world, and he wields breathtaking powers to do so. On the softer end, whenever if you're a parent in China, whenever your child starts school, he or she gets handed a little book of Xi Jinping thought that promotes values like filial piety, diligence, and harmony. But you have much more coercive measures, such as the re-education centers of Muslim populations in the western part of that country. That is the pointy end of the good life. More civilization than state, China does not merely seek to win the hearts and minds of its subjects, it crafts them from cradle to grave. But if China is just the first among equals, it is by no means the only perfectionist illiberal regime. In India, Prime Minister Modi's government has fused populism with Hinduvata, an ethno-nationalist and spiritual doctrine championed by a paramilitary volunteer organization. In Russia, President Vladimir Putin writes long, semi-mystical essays on the greatness and the vulnerability of the Russian soul. This is something Westerners don't get. Putin reads. Like, what? Putin reads. He has ideas. Not to be outdone when it comes to turning a phrase, Viktor Orban declares that being Hungarian is, quote, a task, a mission, probably the most beautiful mission in the world. What do we think? Agree or disagree? Anyway, continue. And he backs his rhetoric with policies like lifetime tax exemptions for young mothers and very generous state funding for arts and media aligned with nationalistic ideals. And the US may be late to the game, but when post-liberal ideas move from books into the orbit of power, up to and including vice presidents like J.D. Vance, the US might not be far behind. My point is that an increasing number of regimes claim to know what constitutes a life worth living for their people, are confident that their vision enjoys popular support, and are prepared to wield persuasive and coercive powers to advance it. And if minorities, or even numerical majorities like women, protest these visions as discriminatory and unequal, well, too bad. As the Catholic Church once put it, error has no rights. This kind of moral confidence, or depending on your point of view, moral arrogance, is the hallmark of perfectionist regimes. It's easy to scoff at least for liberals, but to dismiss these regimes as purely repressive is to underestimate what they offer to citizens. Not just order, but meaning, not just a control, but a vision as to how to live. And to conclude 2 minutes, do I have this one? Yeah. To conclude 2 minutes, here is my truly provocative point, I believe, for a liberal audience. I can put it this way, I'll go off script for a second. I wrote a book about liberalism as a way of life, and I championed why a liberal way of life could be great, and why it is as worthy of devotion as any historic religion. May not agree with that, but that's my claim. I think liberalism does certain things very well in terms of human flourishing and human excellence and personality traits. I think it does freedom, fairness, tolerance, irony really, really well. But there is a whole swath of human excellences that liberalism sucks at realizing and leaves to wither on the vine. Things like loyalty, sacrifice, devotion, faith, non-instrumental relationships to nature. There's a whole gamut of human flourishing that liberalism is deaf and dumb to. And what I want to say, no single regime, no single ethical or religious system is able to capture all human excellences. They do some things well and some things badly. But these regimes, even if they may be alloyed with violence and self-control, I firmly believe that they also champion great human goods, goods that liberalism often diminishes or fails to deliver. For example, filial piety, harmony, and respect for hierarchies are central to the selfhood promoted by the Chinese Communist Party. Here in Hungary, I did some prep for this trip, of course, and I read your constitution very carefully. I read its special attention, I know some people think it's just words, but to the fundamental law and the avowal at the very beginning. And in that avowal, your country names 3 values that they say is basically the point of this country. And I read those with Western eyes, and I'm like, what the hell? This is so weird. Not that they're bad values, but what are they doing in a constitution? And those values are love, loyalty, and faith. Not things liberals do pretty well. And if liberals deny that these are human goods, and if liberals fail to acknowledge their appeal for people who see the world differently than they do, then I think we liberals miss the main drivers of the appeal of these non-liberal movements. And we will be astonished day in and day out when Fidesz wins the next election coming up, or when Donald Trump, whatever, his successor, is successful. I just don't think we can understand our opponents unless we see what they value in positive terms with generosity. And on this point, I hope the project achieves real value pluralism, the kind that Isaiah Berlin, a famous liberal thinker, spoke about in this book. And he wrote a phrase that is really a guiding star for me. He said that some among the great goods cannot live together. We are doomed to choose, and every choice may entail an irredeemable loss. You cannot, pace Sheryl Sandberg, have it all. Different value systems do different things well. And he continues, we are free to criticize the values of other cultures, to condemn them, but we cannot pretend not to understand them at all or to regard them simply as subjective, the products of creatures in different circumstances with different tastes from our own, which do not speak to us at all. Forgive the cheekiness of giving an uber-liberal like Berlin the final word of my remarks, but that's the spirit I hope animates the project I'm working on. Thanks. Oh, the old slide.
Thank you, Alexander, for that excellent presentation. I can't say I disagree with much. I do find kind of the descent into Applebaumism hilarious, like they're all corrupt. It's like, yeah, we know what happens in the Clinton Foundation and the Blair Foundation. You know, this moral purity test is bizarre to me, especially given certain revelations around liberal NGOs and so on in recent years. But that's turning it into politics, right? And it's not really a serious debate. And the fact that it's got to that point, I think, shocks actually post-liberals who, I read your essay and you kind of say, they sneer at stuff like that because they don't see it as intellectually serious. So to keep it intellectually serious, rather than descent into Applebaumism or Sikorskyism, whatever he's posting on Twitter these days, two things, I think, points of disagreement, at least with me. I won't speak for all post-liberals. The term perfectionism really stood out when I read your essay, because that's something that rubs up against conservatives generally. And post-liberals are a species of conservatives, no matter what people say otherwise. Perfectionism to me implies a sort of utopianism of some sort. It implies that there's some sort of a new man to create. I think in your essay you talk about Homo Sovieticus. And of course, that's the new man. It's the new man that is implicit in Rousseau's thought and in Marxist thought and so on. And I mean, not only do I think post-liberals don't have that conception, but I think, at least I would say, liberals have that conception, because to my mind, liberalism is a species of Enlightenment utopianism. And I think the ideal liberal subject, there is an ideal type for a liberal subject, and I'm not going to spend 5 minutes complaining about the woke gone mad, and I think there's no point anymore. But I think everybody knows what the ideal type of a liberal subject is. It's somebody who kind of, almost, I mean, we've got so far now that they have to be politically correct to a T or engage in some sort of a struggle session. Literally. I mean, we see politically correct struggle sessions among liberals. That is perfectionism. I don't think anyone in post-liberal circles or in conservative circles wants struggle sessions on, any ideals. I'm Catholic. The Catholic Church would certainly not encourage that kind of thing. They encourage confession privately and forgiveness. So very opposite to perfectionism. And, you say in confession, like, I won't do it again, and the priest is like, see you next week. So it's a very different attitude. So I don't think they're going for perfectionism. And I think if you read something, not even to go into the Catholic tradition, but I think if you read something like the Nicomachean Ethics, I don't think what's being aimed at is perfection. I think it's some sort of a golden mean of behavior, some sort of prudence and realistic behavior and so on. And I think that's reflected in the way that so-called post-liberal regimes probably behave. Yes, of course, Viktor Orban here, and I'd say the same about Xi Jinping in China, having spent quite a bit of time in China recently. They do put out ideals for the population, but no one really expects people to live up to it, you know? I think the ideals are just ideals. Everybody needs ideals. You need ideals of behavior. Liberals have ideals of behavior. To my mind, they're enforced in a totalitarian way, and that's where the utopianism and perfectionism comes in. So I understand that's probably not what you're going for, but definitely, from my perspective, when I see that, I think Enlightenment rationalistic utopianism. And I don't think post-liberals are going for that, and I don't think they're going for some Catholic version of that or nationalist version of that. Some of the weirder fringes of the alt-right ethnic stuff is a form of perfectionism, but no post-liberals are into that. And if anyone's conflating us with them, they're lying, actually, because we all know all about those ideologies. The second thing I'd say is, wasn't so much in your speech, but I read the essay, and I think, at least from my perspective, because I've just written a book, The Collapse of Global Liberalism, the other aspect that the liberals don't get, and I think it's only something that's beginning to be discussed now, so I'm not surprised that it wasn't in the last book, is that aspects of liberalism may actually be self-contradictory, and the ideology itself may actually be highly unstable. That's kind of the thesis of my book. It's kind of an almost Marxian thesis, you know, in that some of the things that they impose on society self-undermine the system itself. I mean, I won't go into it now. I'm not going to show the book, but just to give one example, the American liberal experiment, as you said, was like mush people in this like liberal box and they'll all get on. They're not getting on in America. America's turning into an increasingly violent political system. Now, a post-liberal or even a conservative would say, yeah, told you so. It's pretty hard for people who are very different, especially if they have very different belief structures, to live next to one another. And that's just one aspect. You could go into all sorts of things like liberalism's attitude toward children and the inability to replace the population and so on. Anyway, buy the book, whatever. But the point is, there actually may be self-undermining dynamics as well. I'm not saying that as a criticism of the essay or of your presentation, but it would raise another level of the question. Is liberalism actually sustainable? Because one of the things, just I'll finally say, because we're on the clock, obviously, the problem with the kind of crude stuff, the Applebaumism and stuff like that, is I don't think they even have a good explanation of why liberalism's kind of falling apart. Like, from somebody like Applebaum's perspective, obviously, Russia went from kind of a liberal country in the 90s to a non-liberal country. I don't think she has any explanation of that beyond milk corruption or something like that, as if corruption doesn't exist in the United States and DC. Corruption doesn't exist in DC, get out of here, right? So she doesn't actually have an explanation of that, and I think it's interesting. I said it when Andrew Koppelman was here in December, that liberals are very, very willing to recognize real power politics, realpolitik, Marxian kind of analyses of government and so on, when applied to non-liberal regimes. But they seem to have a really hard problem seeing that liberal regimes can behave like that too, and they clearly can. So I just put those points out there. But overall, I think we agree on more than we disagree with. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. There's a lot of things I heard here I want to agree with. But before I start, maybe I also need to give myself a little bit of a story, because Alex is the liberal who ventures out into illiberal realms to find out what's happening out there, and Philip is the staunch defender of proponent of post-liberalism. I am a sociologist from Amsterdam, so when I was growing up, everyone around me was progressive or liberal. And then I lived for 5 years in Beijing, worked in Beijing, Peking University, and now I've been here in Hungary for 3 years. So when Alex says liberalism on a theoretical level, when you read Rawlsian philosophy, pretends that it's just a minimalistic or when you read a certain part of rules, but forget about the full picture of rules. There's a certain ideal, typical self-image of liberalism that says liberalism is this very minimalistic framework where you honor the rights of the individual, but everyone in their own lives will have the freedom to think for themselves. Well, how do you organize an education system, right? An education system needs to be informed by certain values. So that's where things in practice start sliding very quickly, and Alex rightly points that out. So I want to say, so first of all, it's great that when Alex does his reflections on liberalism, that the first strength is exactly this, that he doesn't deny that liberalism in practice slides. So when Philip says these liberals are pretty intolerant in practice often, then actually Alex has already admitted that, in fact, that is in fact a practical reality. And now, and then a further strong point of Alex is that he really does the venturing out thing. So we may take it for granted, but liberalism, especially because it's so powerful in the dominant cultural and intellectual centers in the West, has the tendency to become very bubble-like. It closes in upon itself. It sees the outside world as comprising a collection of authoritarians, totalitarians, corrupt leaders that deceive the people. And all these people out there, in their hearts, they just want to be like liberal people in Amsterdam, liberal people in Sydney. But they were manipulated by this political class. And then usually the liberal press in the West, will point at a particular culprit for each country. So then it's Modi in India, it's Xi Jinping in China, and each country will have its main boogeyman. And if only that person would not be there, or if the next election would have a different outcome, or they would be deposed, everything would be different. So that's fantasy world, that self-centric fantasy world. Alex just steps out of that, and he says, no, we're going to actually explore the world, and what do we find there? We find divergent traditions of genuine idealism. We find out that other places in the world are just like the liberal West, in that there are genuine ideals, but people also abuse ideals. Sometimes people cite ideals opportunistically, but often people try to live up to ideals. But then they fail to. But then in practice, they often fail to live up to those ideals, which doesn't mean that the ideals are not real, because ideals are always something you strive towards. So falling short of them is the normal situation, right? Now, here comes a bit of it's not really a criticism, it's more of a complementary point, and it's in line with what Philip said. The perfectionism, the supposed perfectionism out there in the non-liberal world is, first of all, it's not there when you talk about conservative post-liberals, right? So they don't have this perfection. They have a sense of Christian fallibility, so they don't have this perfectionist sense where each human being can be morally improved. However, there are some places in the world that have perfectionist ideologies. So China has a very, very powerful perfectionist mainstream. In Chinese political thought has the idea humans can be morally transformed on a very fundamental level, and if you have the right people in power and they execute the program, we can lift up the suzhi, the civilizational level of the entire society. So the Chinese mainstream is actually very utopian and very perfectionist, and that's not similar to the conservative and post-liberal critics in the West of Western liberalism. However, there is like a nuance within a nuance, because even though on a theoretical level places like China are perfectionists, the actual sociology is much more complex. So you don't actually have a good life state. So officially, China is a good life state, but only on the political philosophical level. In practice, China, like all other places in the world, have to handle pluralism, right? There are Muslims in China, there are Christians in China. Xi Jinping thought, even the most staunch defenders of Xi Jinping thought, disagree with each other on how certain ideas need to be interpreted. And the political elite keeps the ideas pretty general, so there is room for interpretation. So what do you do if you manage a sociology department at Peking University, or you have or you're running a magazine in China or a blog, right, with different authors? you have to handle pluralism. So it's not just the liberals, it's not just Rawlsian liberals that handle pluralism. Everyone in the world handles pluralism, even if their political philosophy doesn't emphasize that aspect. And the liberals, just like everyone else, even though they always talk about pluralism, when they're running an education system, they're installing their values. So everyone does this thing when they organize an education for their young, they're going to install their own values, and everyone in different formats, from the low to the high, from like a little online blog to running a country, will face certain forms of pluralism and will have to handle that. So that's just as a caveat that what you're saying is a lot on the political philosophical level, and on the sociological level, things are much messier.
I don't know if Alex, if you have a response to the two comments, but I have some questions too for you guys. But
I have one. I just want to reply to one thing which I think is interesting. I've got pushback from a bunch of audiences on the perfectionism word. It's a term of art in political philosophy, and I hear the echoes that you don't want, and I don't want them either. I don't want the utopianism, or I don't think it's doomed to that. But maybe I just ditched the term, so that's fine. But on the other hand, Aristotle is classified typically as a perfectionist. And so here, this is a dumb little story, but I ran a Twitter poll a few weeks ago on what I should call my new book. So I have some titles that are, I don't know what to call this thing. And so I listed some options. And I have one troll on the internet that trolls me, and that troll, I like my enemies, is Adrian Vermeule. And Adrian Vermeule retweeted my tweet, and he said, hey, Alex, how about you call your book what political philosophy, the title should be, What Political Philosophy Has Always Been Until About 200 Years Ago, which is the idea that political philosophy always had a laser focus on the good life, Aristotle included. The first move of Aristotle's politics is to say, okay, we have the polis, which is an association, but why? Like, this is a means for what end? And the end, naturally, is the good life. And so it's motivated, the political body is motivated by an ethical vision. And it doesn't have to be Soviet-style perfection, but in my world, that's called, anyway, so that's what I was trying to touch on. But interestingly, I think the post-liberals are interestingly and intelligently pre-liberal. They're trying to recover that teleological tradition that liberalism is just like, no, we can't do that. Liberalism has reasons, and we can talk about that as to why it bailed on teleology. But there's a revival of it, and I think that's what it's going back to the oldest thing. Now, the one thing I would want to push back on one thing Philip said, and then I'll hand over, is about this conservative moniker. And this is something maybe everyone in this room knows this except for me. So forgive my wandering into a room here, but if I'm right, and a lot of post-liberals agree, or we agree with each other, which is that liberal values have basically infected all areas of civil society, and they've taken over it's not just that they've done institutional capture. They have universities, media, blah, blah, blah. But also they've done worldview capture, such that we perceive the world through optics of individualism, irony, tolerance, blah, blah, blah. And if that has buried itself like a tick into not just every institution, but into every mindset, then a conservative overturning of liberalism has to be very, very radical indeed. Response?
I don't change the language if you don't want to. I hate this language stickler stuff, but I think teleological is a better description than perfectionism, to be honest.
Done.
Sorry if I may interject there. The problematic thing is that teleological can refer to telos, the Greek notion of telos, as you find it in Aristotle and Plato, where everything in the universe has a certain telos, right? But the problem is, in a modern context, teleological is very much associated with this Hegelian notion of progressive historiography and utopianism. And so when I think of teleology, I think of Fukuyama's The End of History. Yeah. And therefore, I think you automatically get mega confused if you say that liberalism is not teleological, even though it is so obviously teleological in the Hegelian sense.
So here, I'll run a focus group and find the least offensive term that will
offend
no demographic.
Hegel's a liberal. We can't let him steal the term teleological. It's an Aristotelian term, so I refuse this. Just really quickly on the depth thing. So you're right, which is why I'm quite pessimistic about Western liberal societies. I think they're going to collapse. I hope they don't, but I see increasing evidence that they probably will. Do you require some sort of radical intervention? I mean, look, I'll tell you this just from a political point of view. a bunch of people went into the Trump administration, and their favorite phrase was, "You can just do things." They're fast finding that you can't just do things. And we kind of have a bit of a joke, a few of us, that you pull one lever and like the opposite thing happens. When a system becomes really broken, it's very hard to reform. And it's nice to kind of stand on a podium and say, I'm not saying you're doing this, but it's nice to stand on a podium and say, we need radical change. And it's like, yeah, but... So I agree on a fundamental level. I'm a little bit skeptical that you can actually do that. And the last thing I'd say on that is, to the extent that there is a post-liberal society in Hungary, it's debatable. I think it's sort of post-liberal. It's sort of Christian democratic still. But, you know, it's been a, 16-year project, and it's been pretty gradualistic. I guess there's been some radical reforms in the system in those 16 years. But nothing crazy's happened. I think the actual problem for post-liberals and critics of liberalism is that they need a very long time to do proper quote-unquote regime change at a depth level. And that's very, very hard to do in Western democracies. And you could say, oh, well, then you're calling for an end to democracy. I'm not calling for anything, really. I'm just saying, like, those are the constraints around government from a realistic perspective.
So I like the fact you mentioned Berlin, Isaiah Berlin in this, and you've just been debating the terminology, teleology, or perfectionism, but Isaiah Berlin wrote a famous essay called The Pursuit of the Ideal. And this essay is a 20-page essay, one of the greatest essays I've ever read on political philosophy, and where he really says everything in the Western mind has been pursuing ideals, and that we always assume that answers exist, that we can find them, and we can act on them for the greater good. There's three sort of axioms about that.
Sorry, can you say it one more time?
His three axioms of the ideal, he said that we presume that answers exist, that we can find them, and that we can therefore act on them for the greater good.
Right.
And he critiques this. He says actually a lot of the things we do since the Greeks is pursue ideals. And if you look at these two different visions that you've been discussing here of sort of the liberal ideal, of which you are a proponent yourself, but recognize, I think, some of its challenges right now. But I think also then there's an alternative set of understandings of how the world should be run. You noted the difference of focus on loyalty, sacrifice, devotion, a less utilitarian view of nature, faith, these sorts of things that are not included in the liberal model. These are still a form of idealism, of course. Yes. But does not human history falsify all forms of ideal? Because the truth is we live in reality. Life is not ideal. That's the essence of it. We live to survive our paradoxes, as the great Canadian band, The Tragically Hip, once said. But the...
Don't quote The Tragically Hip against me.
Yeah. So my question is here, you know, we can debate these ideals, be they liberal or post-liberal, but is there such thing as an achievable good life in either of these images?
Achievable, perhaps. Stable, perhaps not. I think that's what you're getting at.
Well, I mean, this is an interesting distinction. I mean, between stable and achievable. How would you draw that distinction?
So, let me build on your Berlin reference with another. So, the most famous of all pieces, everyone here knows it, is the two concepts of liberty. And Berlin was really, really scared of, like, negative liberty, really, really scared of positive liberty. Whenever I ask my students, everyone knows. Every undergrad I teach, like negative liberty, like, yeah, the state shouldn't mess with you. They get that. Then I say, what's positive liberty? No one knows. No one actually knows how Berlin defined it. And Berlin defined positive liberty as the conquest of the lower self by the higher self, a form of ethical perfectionism. And he's like, if you want to do that in your spare time, in your private life, as a life's mission, you do that. But it was a terrifying prospect if states were to take on that project, which is why he feared the Soviet Union so much. He didn't fear its redistributive aspect, he feared its ethical totality project. So in this sense, when we pursue those kinds of projects, and here I think we're just in heated agreement with state power, it's just a very unstable, very unpredictable kind of process that can lead to a lot of wreckage. I would agree with that. Was that your question?
Sort of. I mean, I suppose my question is we put a lot of energy into what are our values. Politics is divided on visions of the good life. Does it matter if either is not technically achievable? Is the pursuit the point, in a sense?
Yes, sure. Yes.
And so, but if you don't think it's achievable, what's wrong with a post-liberal set of values? Is it not still a form of stability?
This is getting tricky. Okay, liberals have two big problems with this kind of stuff that I'm talking about. Old school liberals, 19th century liberals, really loved personal freedom and autonomy, and so anything that smelled of paternalism was bad. J.S. Mill is big on that. New school liberals don't really talk about that so much. They talk about state power as being acceptable only if it can be justified through acceptable reasons. So, like if we pursue a certain policy, you can't say because Christianity says so. You have to give non-believers a reason to comply with that. And most ethical goods cannot be given the kinds of suitable reasons that would render political power legitimate for liberals. You're going to say, have kids in Hungary. Why? If you tell someone because that's the key to a good life, a lot of people are going to bucket that, and they'll really chafe at the use of state power, state funds, treasury to support that. So that's the problem with that sort of pursuit for liberals. It's unjustifiable in terms of political values, and they'll just say, F you, I didn't sign up to your ethical vision, you're imposing that on me. Make sense?
Yeah, it does.
Yeah.
Philip, any thoughts?
Well, only that this touches on a core aspect of family policy. So I've been a big proponent of family policy. I've done a lot of the economic work. I have a book coming out next year with a demographer on the economics of family policy. And we've seen it go from my co-author Paul Morland being called a fascist in the Times of London to being basically almost mainstream now. And what's been really interesting about it is, as Alex says, we've been able to sell it on grounds of technocracy. That's right. We've basically been able to say, if you don't reproduce, here are the consequences of an aging society. It's been really easy, actually. I've kind of been snickering in the background. The issue with that is, I don't think it's going to fly. You can't go around and tell people, like, look, you need to reproduce because we need to keep the old age dependency ratio in check. You can kind of sell to the left, like if you like your welfare state, you might want to ensure that you have kids. You can go back to Gunnar Myrdal, Swedish social democracy. I know all this stuff, and you can justify based on utilitarian grounds, which is what the liberals, especially Rawls and so on, really like. And you can succeed in that argument. The problem is when you get to the next step, and we're finding that here in Hungary with the family policy, when you get to the next step, you realize that you're wading into something that's not interest rate policy at the central bank. And at that point, here's what I'd say. You're not going to run a successful, purely technocratic family policy. And I think the liberals who have been relatively supportive of the idea of family policy are going to run into that very quick. They're going to, you could say that we kind of tricked them. And yeah, that was part of the point, I'll be honest, because I was there. We did kind of trick them. But what they're going to realize is that the technocratic stuff doesn't work. That's not how you motivate human behavior in that regard. It does work, for example, if you lower interest rates at the central bank. That will increase mortgage applications. Yes, as an economist, I will say it works. But when you get into the sticky stuff of family policy and so on, they'll quickly find that it doesn't work. And so in Hungary, they're taking increasingly a more holistic approach to this. And eventually, yes, we're going to have to change the propaganda in our societies. There's absolutely no other way. And we're going to have to do it really extensively. And as you said, the Netflix slop, it may still be slop, but it's going to have to be family-friendly slop if this is going to work. So I think, in a sense, the realities of some of the problems that liberalism's generating will actually lead to an overturning of the deep philosophical layers of it, because you won't be able to justify any of this stuff on utilitarian grounds.
Eric.
Yeah, so I with this whole discussion, I'm constantly this whole conversation, I'm constantly looking at where do the actual substantive differences of interpretation lie, right? And then the family policy and the problem that we have extremely low birth rates throughout the developed world, except for Israel, is again one of those. It's again one of those topics where what I see is that it apparently doesn't really matter if you have a liberal regime or an explicitly anti or illiberal regime, because China is a Chinese socialist regime, and it has an enormous problem with the birth rate. But then South Korea and Japan and Taiwan, they have similar problems, right? And then you go to Europe, similar case, and then even in North America, the birth rates are getting very low. So then, with all these political discussions, people will say, well, it's the problem of liberalism or it's the problem of progressivism. But then I don't see a lot of the things happening on the ground do not really follow any of these political theoretical distinctions. So this is an example where the problem on the ground doesn't follow the political theoretical distinctions. But this whole thing about how you manage pluralism and how much you try to impose a substantive vision of the good life. Also, that is something that most of that disappears when you actually, on a meso level or in a micro level, on the ground in China or in Hungary, right? So Hungary would, I mean, people here live in Hungary, or most of you live in Hungary, so there's not a very worked out sense of the good life that is systematically communicated via the media and the education system, right? This is a space where people, we come together in places like the Danube Institute because this is all a work in progress. We are having debates, we're playing with ideas. We have all kinds of different opinions about all these, about the most important matters. So then I'm thinking, isn't everyone just doing the same thing where we have certain ideals? We've noticed that other people in our society have either different ideals or slightly different version of our ideals. Then we have to handle that somehow. We still want to push for the things that we think are important, but we don't want to be intolerant at the same time. And then the world just becomes really messy. So the only thing what I think is clear is that in the liberal self-presentation, liberalism is supposed to be something that's very tolerant and open to pluralism, even though it doesn't really work in practice most of the time. But then if you go to China, the self-presentation is we have this harmonious vision that we are passing on to all our children. But then again, they're also there in China. Then if you actually look into what the substantive content of that vision is supposed to be, it is actually very, very thin. And because it's so thin, it's worked out in different ways throughout society. And then I'm just wondering, like, where are we? Well, what are we actually talking about here? What is the debate?
Yep. Sorry, Alex, do you have a comment on that?
No, I'll fold it into something.
Okay.
It's good, thank you.
Well, I thought I'd just ask a question for the three of you here. I mean, the context of this discussion at all, of the emergence of what we might call post-liberal regimes, or I'm not really sure even what to term it in a way that isn't simply the opposite of a liberal regime. But whatever is happening now, the context is that the liberal regimes seem to be giving up their sort of nimbus, in a sense. And they're losing their authority, their power, their influence, their orthodoxy, in a sense. People are beginning to question things everywhere, it seems. And I'm wondering, you've all touched on this a bit, but I'm wondering what each of you think is the diagnosis as to why liberalism is failing. And I'm curious about any differences in how you diagnose that failure. Perhaps maybe Philip might be worth you starting on this. Why has liberalism failed, Philip?
Let him go.
I just read a book on this. Really good. Can I recommend it? Because I think it's inherently self-contradictory at a deep level. To my mind, what liberalism is all about is basically demolishing what they see as arbitrary hierarchies in society. Right? Those can be hierarchies of the king over his subject in Cromwellian England. Those can be the hierarchy of the father over the children in sort of whatever it is, second or third wave or 12th wave feminism. I can't remember. It's like a Transformer movie. It can be any of those. It can be ethical hierarchies within your own mind, like why should you do this rather than that. And so the way that they actually have come to justify these things, Alex has already said, they've reverted to utilitarian norms. And I won't go into it now, but you can write like terse philosophical language of why these utilitarian norms can be interpreted in many different ways and they're kind of useless or whatever. They use economic language, actually. They use the language of Pareto optimality a lot of the time, as if they're talking about the distribution of resources or something like that. It's slightly unusual, but the point is that if you buy into my concept that effectively the goal of liberalism is to undermine what they see as arbitrary hierarchies, and that's basically any hierarchy that can't be justified through some sort of utilitarian framework. And the pursuit of that, obviously, what is the goal of that? It's to maximize individual so-called freedom, although freedom's never defined. It's sort of this black hole that you'll find in Jean-Paul Sartre or something like that. But that's effectively what the structure, to my mind, does. Now, if you adhere to anything resembling natural law principles, you will think that hierarchies in society are not arbitrary. They're actually very real. Very real. And that they do not need justifications based on biology, for example. You don't need evolutionary psychology to tell you why certain social hierarchies should be there. In fact, I think that the evolutionary psychology version of many of those events are a sort of a weird mythos within liberal discourse. It's a cope, as they say online. But if you believe in natural law principles, you'll understand that that hierarchies are completely necessary. And you'll go back, I know in your essay you refer to Plato's Republic, the cycle of regimes theory, and you will understand that there is an awful lot of literature running from ancient Greece right up until, I guess, the Renaissance period that discusses these cycle of regime issues, and they all say basically the same thing. If you, I mean, this is my kind of minimum version of it, because I'm an economist, I guess. They're basically saying if you demolish good hierarchies, you will first cause anarchy, and then after the anarchy, you will cause tyranny, because bad hierarchies will start to form. That's effectively, in a nutshell, what cycle of regimes theories say. And so, to go to your point, why is liberalism collapsing? Twofold. First of all, because it was tried. It's the same reason the communism collapsed, because it was tried. If you buy into my vision, it's not a functional political ideology, and it was never really tried before. Liberalism's been around, on my reading, for about half a millennium, but it was always alloyed with other regimes. You occasionally got a hard burst of liberalism in the French Revolution, for example, and you got chaos. You always get chaos. The American Revolution was very tempered liberalism, so it was quite successful. You could say similar about the Irish Republican Revolution, even more tempered than the American Revolution. It had a very strong Catholic element to it. But so you occasionally saw these outbursts of liberalism, 1848 Paris Commune and so on. You'll see it again. Marxism and liberalism, to my mind, are very similar. But you never really got it at a deep level in society. In the 20th century, liberalism was mainly a bohemian aspect of life for the upper classes. It's not a great way to run a society, but it can tolerate it, as long as the mass of people aren't living that lifestyle. What's happened, on my reading, is that since the 1990s, since the end of the Cold War, and especially since the 2000s, after Bush, basically, the Obama administration era, we have actually democratized liberalism. We've spread it through all the media forms that Alex has talked about. And lo and behold, cycle of regimes is kicking off. Go on your Twitter and you're starting to see anarchy and chaos. And we risk falling again into some sort of a tyranny. That's my reading of the situation anyway. So, short answer, liberalism's collapsing because we finally tried it.
Can I?
Yeah.
No.
May I? Well.
No, you go.
Yeah, because I take issue with the assumption in the question, because Callum asked why is liberalism failing, and it seems to be losing its mojo, and then Philip gives us a list of things that he thinks is responsible for the failure of liberalism. But let's reflect on this. What if liberalism is not failing? What if we have the perception that liberalism is failing, and then we ask, why do we have the perception that liberalism is failing? This is the move that Philip Mano makes. He's a political theorist in Germany making waves in the German discussion, and he's coming to the Danube Institute to give a speech in March, beginning of March. He says that what liberalism has been doing, what liberal thinkers have been doing, and liberal institutions have been doing, is they've been labeling ever more things as illiberal. If you label ever more things illiberal, you're going to be surrounded by this illiberal world, and then you're like, whoa, it's huge. It's huge. Think of it this way. In Europe, in the 19th century, nationalism is a powerful ideology. Nationalism is still a powerful ideology in more subtle ways, right? Because nation states, national democracies, are based on the locus of the nation, right? You give voting rights, you give citizenship rights to the members of a nation. So nationalism is something that always comes back in different forms in nation states, in democratic nation states. Now, the liberals saw that did it in the 19th century and up until the middle of the 20th century, even the late 20th century, didn't see that as an anti-liberal thing. Most liberals were also nationalists. So you were a liberal and you were a nationalist. You could also be a conservative and a nationalist, or socialist and a nationalist, right? But then at some point, the liberals started saying, actually, nationalism is a counterforce to liberalism. But nationalism at the same time is the locus of the democratic nation state. It seeps out of the pores of our regime. So you're going to find like illiberalism all around you all of a sudden, right? So it's not that illiberalism is on the rise. We've just been calling everything illiberal. Like what are the actual non-liberal credentials of the Fidesz party, right? Right? So if you actually look at this from like a 1970s lens, you're not going to find a lot of strong illiberal ideologies incompatible with your liberal ideology if you're a 1970s liberal walking in the Visegrad countries nowadays, right? So this is largely a projection. Like the liberal world has been narrowing in on itself. It's become more and more of a bubble. And it sees the outside world as like, oh, this anti-liberal authoritarians everywhere that are attacking us. And that mindset has created the illusion that liberalism is actually failing. It's not failing. It's actually really powerful and robust. It has a powerful political philosophy. It's an intuition that's widespread throughout the West. Even conservatives, they just can't get out of like liberal assumptions. It overwhelms us.
Before moving,
But just really quickly, that begs the question of why they're calling everything illiberal. On my account, that's because that's the natural tendency of liberalism. They go after hierarchical structures. When they're finished with this, they go after that. But you'd need an alternative explanation of why liberals have become like that, why they're seeing demons and monsters everywhere. I have an account of that. You need to give an alternative one.
I have an account. I agree that that's out of liberalism has this tendency to see these beasts and monsters all around themselves because you have to complete history, right? Fukuyama's end of history, Hegelian end of history. You have to complete history. History is not. We're not living in the blueprint has not been fully implemented yet, or there's still some things that are not perfect, and hence there must be people blocking the progress of history, right? So you're looking for like people to blame for your liberal perfection, ironically enough, not having fully taken over everything. But it doesn't actually show. Don't believe the liberals. So don't follow the liberal logic in now judging liberalism to be failing. Actually, bracket the whole thing and say I'm going to look at it from my own conceptions, and then you might find out that liberalism is actually alive and kicking, even if they cannot see that. Yeah?
before we get out, I just want to challenge you on that, though, Eric. That if liberalism is, in a sense, eating its own headspace, if it's kind of assuming, almost paranoid about the world around it, is that it may not be that illiberalism itself is growing, but if the liberal hive mind, if the mind is starting to think that is getting paranoid, is that not itself a sign of failure? That it's almost becoming delusional? Is that not failure?
Well, okay, if that's your definition of failure, it is failure.
I'm saying,
well,
could you define it that way?
It sees itself as failure. It will ultimately see itself as a failure.
But that is failure.
Of failure is madness.
Well, yeah, it seems like failure. So at a meta level, is that not in the liberals? If the liberals themselves no longer understand what a liberal, if they themselves are no longer liberal enough to include the rest of the world, and if they cease to be liberals, has not liberalism failed?
Yeah, but we need to be sure that we shouldn't buy into it to the extent that we think that there are all kinds of powerful anti-liberal forces that have been growing in the last few decades, because that's actually not the case.
But the perception, by your argument, the perception that there are those forces growing within the liberal mind would imply that liberalism is failing as a mindset, because it's ceasing to be tolerant as it's seeing demons everywhere.
Yeah, so I'm we can argue semantics, but the important thing is not to.
I don't think it's semantics, though. Sorry, I don't think it is. I mean,
maybe
there's a fundamental. If people cease, it's like a currency. A currency has value until people decide it no longer has value. Yeah. So if a political philosophy is inherently a philosophy, it's people believe it. If they cease to believe the tenets of their own philosophy, is it still?
No, but that's the thing. They may not cease to believe the tenets of their own philosophy. It's just that people may at some point, they may go so crazy that they give up on it. But then the people who declared themselves post-liberal actually have a liberal ideology, even though they may not be aware of that.
Would it help the liberals if they had a little bit of Soulcraft, do you think, to fix the
Just
problem.
a pinch.
It's a pinch. Alex.
Psychiatry, maybe.
Psychiatry.
Okay, I want to keep this short because I want to open. Can we open for questions after?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, sorry. Yeah.
No, it's cool. Okay, so why is liberalism unstable or falling apart? I'll say two things. First thing, contrary to my esteemed colleague, I don't think the reason liberalism is failing is because there's a fatal internal contradiction to it. I think liberalism is failing today because liberals suck at liberalism. That's my answer. I think being liberal is defined by two traits of character. It means to be someone who is free, but it also means someone who is generous. And in the last 20 years, liberalism has ceased to be generous. It basically pulled up the drawbridge on social mobility, and then it turned to woke cancel culture and pouncing down people's throat. And so I don't think liberalism is collapsing because of a dialectic thing. I think it's collapsing out of a character thing. And that's my first diagnosis. The second thing I want to say, and this is, like, you have a real live liberal here, and if you remember one thing about what I said about liberalism, this is the thing to remember. Liberalism, this is a historical point, but it turns into a conceptual one. Liberalism was born in the 19th century. That was the first time people started using the word liberal to describe themselves in a political sense. You can find old school people, Locke, Montesquieu, that are liberal-ish, but people only started calling themselves liberal in the 19th century. Why was liberalism born in the 19th century? Because people were terrified of democracy. The French Revolution happened and everyone lost their shit. There was popular power, there was excess, there was Jacobins, there was guillotine. That stuff is terrifying. And if you think of all the major institutions associated with liberalism, individual rights, division of powers, judicial review, you can keep on going, all of those institutions are explicitly anti-majoritarian. Liberal institutions are built to contain and control popular power. And what I see today happening around the world is we had a very semi-stable marriage between liberalism and democracy for 200 years, and now I think it might be divorce time. I would hate to see that, but that is what I see. Democracy breaking away from liberalism and reasserting itself outside of liberal guardrails. That's how I read the world.
Thank you, Alex. Okay, we've got about 20 minutes for questions. So thinking of questions, one hand at the front. Bidding goes to Sean. Go ahead.
Thank you for this riveting talk. I've really enjoyed it. Alex, in your presentation, you broke down sort of the liberal thought, the classical one, that all authoritarian structures, the leaders driven by desire for sex, money, wealth, power, and they're not driven by the pursuit of the good life. And you're making the argument that no, these are more other structures. They do have a fundamental value. They do have something they're pursuing for the good life. Wouldn't it be fair to say that some do, some don't? Like when you take the case of Venezuela, Hugo Chavez, while he had ideals and things that wanted to guide the country toward not justifying Hugo Chavez, but when we got Maduro on the scene, he definitely, whatever sort of goals Chavez had, he threw them out the window. The original Chavistas were purged, and we had a leader who was extracting all the country's wealth and resources. So do you think that that's just a standalone example, and that most structures are looking for the good life, or is it more in reality a mix?
No, I think you're right. I think that, like sexuality, illiberalism is a spectrum. So I think you're right. I mean, some regimes will be animated more fully by the goods of tyranny. But the regimes that liberalism is really worried about, no one's worried about Venezuela hemorrhaging liberal support. Like they're not just because they're a small country, but they're a contained problem before this the coup. But China, India, I mean, all of these are live civilizational alternatives to liberalism, and I think that the standard model to try to explain them along the kind of the liberal commentariat, the apple bombs, is dumb. It just does not have explanatory power, and I think it's blinded by. I don't even know what it's blinded by, but it's blinded.
So the real competitors to liberalism are actual,
Correct.
have something good life, not.
Yeah. So this is, I mean, I don't want to bring this up, but it gets taught. So Fukuyama said the end of history. He didn't mean like history was up. He just meant that liberalism had no serious ideological contenders anymore, and it was just playing out the string and eventually. But maybe the real ideological contender now is these regimes bringing back the good life. Maybe that's the alternative that he couldn't clock in 1989, and that's back on the horizon. And it wouldn't be a bad contender because it is the oldest strand of political organization to try to live well.
Okay, thank you very much.
John.
I'm just wondering if the distinction that we used to be very familiar with between authoritarianism and totalitarianism doesn't come in here, because of course an authoritarian regime need not be explicitly anti-liberal at all. A totalitarian regime is explicitly anti-liberal, and fundamentally so, because it has a vision of the good life which it intends to impose by murdering its population if absolutely necessary. Now, we know in principle, maybe not so often in practice, that there are authoritarian regimes differ insofar as they're interested principally, and maybe only, in preventing you interfering with who possesses political power.
Yep.
Otherwise, they're not concerned about ballet, agricultural policy, and all of these things. And society carries on, I wouldn't say unaffected, but much less affected. So that at the end of an authoritarian regime, society picks up democracy and liberalism fairly easily and carries on. That's not true in systems like Soviet communism, because all of the elites were complicit in the totalitarianism, and that's a real problem. It takes much longer. So the point here, surely, therefore, is if you have a vision of the good life, and it includes social liberty, if it includes liberty, and I think probably it has to, in my view. I mean, because after all, we look at the distinction between Chinese family policy and the family policy that is being pursued here. There was no, a bad family policy was imposed by diktat, and it produced very bad results until it eventually had to be abandoned. Insofar as that were to be the case here, and I think family policy has its problems, but it's not. Those problems are actually being handled in a way which is dependent upon argument, debate, decision, political debate, and that means a society which has a vision of the good life, or a government which has one, but nonetheless includes liberty in that vision, is unlikely to diverge very far from common sense and other things in the course of its policy.
Thanks, John.
So I agree. Thank you very much. Those terrific comments. First thing, you're completely right on the way regimes can cut. A liberal totalitarianism, that's not happening. I refuse to. But authoritarian liberalism, it's Exhibit A, Singapore. I mean, you can definitely do that. And like I said, if liberalism was born in reaction against democracy, that makes sense. It would be like that. So I capture that point. The China example throws me because the one-child policy was definitely never motivated by even the patina of the good life. It was strictly a population control that had to be shoved down the throats of its population. Whereas you can justify, so that wasn't a good life justification. Okay, right, okay, right. Whoa, okay, this I'm fascinated. Okay, we should talk. Yeah, no, you go now. Okay, no,
short little footnote here. There was there was a notion of suje, which is civilizational level, and the idea was if you have too many children, especially among the lower classes, these are going to be children of lower quality because their parents have left time to teach them well. They're going to be neglected. So that's the standard European eugenics argument, and that was very much tied in with the one-child policy. Now, you may think eugenics, that doesn't sound like the good life. It sounds creepy and Nazi. But of course, a eugenics policy has the good society in mind, because the idea is that you're going to have a better next generation. You're going to have the best children raised by the best parents. So there was an ideal that there was a European eugenics inspired notion behind it. So this one-child policy in China had European roots, and the idea was, that they were going to better the average quality of the next generation of Chinese people. And then they were thinking of education levels, skill level, nutrition.
I just say very quickly on the totalitarian point, I don't think it's actually uncommon, or maybe somebody will correct me, but I think most post-liberals think liberalism is a totalitarian ideology and that it's evolved into one, and it's evolved into one naturally. I mean, what we've watched in the past few years with extreme speech regulations, so-called cancellation, which is the same mechanism that the late Soviet Union used to suppress dissidents. You just didn't get a job. You had to be really disruptive to go to the psychiatric clinic, like really, really disruptive. Most people you couldn't get a job, right? You had to sit on some sort of a Soviet dole. Same thing happened under liberalism. We all know that this stuff happened. So, I mean, I personally see very, very little light between the political machinations of the late Soviet Union and late liberalism. And I think Ryszard Legitko has said the same thing. I don't think he's even a post-liberal. I think he's just a conservative. Obviously, he lived through both regimes, and he finds the liberal one more totalitarian. He said that in his book. And I think that will be the general view of the post-liberals, just for what it's worth. I think it's the doctrinaire view. I know Vermeulen thinks that. I think Deneen thinks that. I know Papen thinks that. So,
what does Hendricks think?
Yeah, I'm sorry, my eyebrows start shooting up here. I mean, that makes no sense, right? Like, so liberals that are intolerant, they may have some, semi-totalitarian tendencies in the most intolerant moments. There's a blink of totalitarianism there, but that, like, liberal systems, they don't do totalitarianism, right? So totalitarianism. So liberals will pretend that they're leaving room for plurality of thought, but then when it's the actual other ideologies show up, they get uncomfortable. They become a bit bitchy sometimes. Humanities department in the U.S. It became very difficult to be a conservative. But it being very difficult to be conservative at an American liberal arts college is not the same thing as being targeted by a totalitarian
people in
regime.
corporate were fired. I'm sorry, it was outside the university.
Yeah, but like being fired is also just like people have always been fired. Like if you had unpopular opinions, you get fired, right? It's just intolerance. There's liberal intolerance, but a little bit of intolerance is not a systematic party-state regime that tries to, in all domains of society, terrorize the people with a well worked out doctrinal ideology. It was instead you would have, you're not allowed to use that word. That's a little bitchy, but it's not a doctrinal content that's pushed by a party state.
Can I pile on here?
Well, just on this actually, I'm just curious, and I mean, you probably have a response, but I'm curious, you mentioned cancel culture before as one of the two areas where liberals have become less generous, and I'm wondering, throughout the cancel culture period of 2020, when everyone was bored and at home and on Twitter, during that period, you saw a lot of references to the Chinese Cultural Revolution and to witchfinder generals and so on. I'm wondering whether you think it's a good comparison.
I don't know. So I just think, okay, so Philip, I don't mean to pile on, and I think that you and I, interestingly, we're horseshoeing a lot. We agree, we agree on a lot of stuff. I just can't follow you. It depends how metaphorical you want to use the word, and you and your kind of the fellow travelers of the post-liberals want to use that word totalitarianism. In my training in political theory, I learned that word through Hannah Arendt and Primo Levi, and totalitarianism means the elimination of human spontaneity from the world. No, that's not ridiculous, because that's the bar that was set through certain regimes. Now, if you want to say it's bad or it's authoritarian or it's unfree, I'm cool. I just think that when you're doing a conceptual stretch such that the word totalitarian just doesn't mean what it does to the regime where it truly applies.
Just very quickly to that, I know the Arendt stuff, and it's very existential and all that, and the criteria is just set too high. That would be my claim. I don't think really existing socialism was, what you read about in Hannah Arendt stuff. I think totalitarianism got mixed up with the Cold War, and a lot of propaganda came out. Let's actually be frank about this. And if you want to actually read realistic accounts of living under totalitarian regimes, a lot of the mechanisms are very similar. It's really just making sure somebody can't be employed. That's the main mechanism for keeping people in control.
How many people were shot during the 2020 social justice protests?
Yeah. So there's
for their views.
There's the quantity, but also the character, right? So I was in Pyongyang in 2018. Where I traveled there from Beijing, right? Reporting for American Affairs, Gladden Pappen's American Affairs journal. It's a long story because Americans couldn't go in. I'm Dutch, so I could go in. So I went to the Korea War History Museum in Pyongyang. It newly opened, a new museum, and I'm in that museum, right? It's an enormous building without windows. And they have these the box figures of dead American soldiers with wind machines behind them. So it's basically a ghost house. It's extremely creepy. And at some point when it really got me the creeps was when I found out that they had written the Chinese and Mao Zedong out of the story of the Korea War. So the Korea War, most of the soldiers on the Northern Front were Chinese. Even their comrades, Mao Zedong, was written out of the story. They're the only person, but he was not really a person, he was a sort of mythical figure, was Kim Il-sung. You had Kim Il-sung, you had the Korean mass of patriotic good people, and you had the imperialists. Even the states, what was it the United States, was it Canada, even they were not specified. There was the imperialists, the good Korean people, and Kim Il-sung. At some point, I was looking everywhere for the museum for references to actual humans because it was a completely dehumanized, solipsistic world, right? I found that some generals on the Northern Front were mentioned by name. No information, just their name on the list. I was like, oh my God, they had names, they were generals. Like, you were suffocating. There was no outside world. It was a world without history and without future. It was a world without humanity and without plurality. That is totalitarianism. That is an entire mindset.
Okay, well, they debated that one to an impasse. So we've got 4 minutes left. Is there a last question? Maybe one or two questions. Anyone at the back? No? No? There we go. Michael.
Thank you, Alex. You're very much a thorough thinker, and I really respect your viewpoints and being a liberal, coming out today, whatever. When I first read the title for this, Becoming, I read from Statecraft to Soulcraft. I was dyslexic, and I read it from Soulcraft to Statecraft. Yeah, right, okay. And one of the works that inspired me and my own kind of political worldview was Man and the State by Jacques Maritain, where the rights proceed from the individual to the state and not vice versa, right? It's weird. Our rights are, above all, come from God. And God is the owner of our souls. He's the grand maker of all life. And we only report to him for our duties and our privileges, and etc. So if we're growing our soul and becoming a more virtuous, responsible, self-governing citizen, we above all go beyond the state. I mean, there's really no solution in a liberal or conservative way of what the state can do to really form me as a free person. So I think in the true liberalism, it's really more of a theological rapport between the individual and his God. And either solution can go our if it's too governing. So I really appreciate what you say, and that the real heart of liberalism is to put a check on the state. And we want guillotines. We don't want this majority rule, but neither on the conservative side we want the rule from the demos either, that are just kind of this mass gang of people enforcing laws and whatnot. How would you reply to that, and what do you think of Jacques Maritain?
So he was the this is irrelevant. He was the student of the philosopher I've dedicated 20 years of study to. So Henri Bergson. I have a tattoo of Bergson right here. I'll show it to you later. So I see the discipleship, and I admire it. And it's a theistic vision of liberalism, and of Cold War liberalism. That I have nothing. I just thank you for the comment, but I have nothing to. There's no friction between us, so I agree with you, and thank you.
Great. Well, I think we're going to wrap it up actually now, guys. No more questions? Okay, well, thank you very much for coming. And I kind of had, since I saw the title, I was thinking the state of our soul, the soul of our state. That's interesting, and that's basically what the Danube covers, all these sorts of topics. So we've got a lot of events coming up in the coming weeks across the spectrum of geopolitics and culture and value and so on. So please check out the website and come along. But let's now thank our fantastic panelists. Thank you very much.